CNN indeed.
Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we're set to deliberate the latest developments here in Israel, throughout the region and beyond, with chief focus today on three separate fronts, namely the one in the Gaza Strip, the one in Lebanon, as well as Iran proper, it's always important to remember how this war began. 377 days ago, on October 7th of last year, the Islamist Hamas and its terror affiliates in the Gaza Strip launched a surprise onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping roughly 250 people, including elderly men, women, children, and infants. 101 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. The subsequent day, Iran essentially joined that war when it greenlighted its proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah, to launch cross-border attacks against Israel. Since then, this Iranian proxy has launched over 12,000 projectiles, and not Hezbollah alone. Additional Iranian proxies from Syria, from Iraq, from Yemen, as well as Iran proper, have launched direct attacks against the state of Israel. Let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, dramatic news today coming out of the Gaza Strip with confirmation potentially for the elimination of the leader of the Islamist Hamas, the one who initiated the October 7th massacre, namely Yahya Sinwar.
Indeed, Jonathan, while October 7th will go down in infamy as the day when Hamas and especially its leader Sinwar started this war, October the 17th, today, may indeed be remembered as the day Sinwar was killed. Now, as we are having this conversation right now, the Israeli Defense Forces have been double-checking, triple-checking, making sure that what has seemed like one of the three terrorists killed in a firefight. Apparently, it wasn't a targeted killing, but rather one of many such firefights in Gaza. One of the three terrorists was Yahya Sinwar. So obviously, if this is the case, there will be many questions. What about the hostages? The three were not surrounded by hostages as human shields at the time. If Sinwar is not there, who is authorized in Hamas to negotiate? Hopefully, they will not harm the hostages as revenge for the death of Sinwar. Many such questions to be asked and hopefully answered in the coming days. There is also, of course, the operation in South Lebanon. It has not been casualty-free. Israel has marked several losses over the last several days, and this is regrettably the price of the methodical uprooting of Hezbollah infrastructure from the area adjacent to the so-called blue line, the boundary between Israel and Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. Oren. We will revert shortly to the Lebanese front, but first, let's turn to Central Israel, where we're joined by Colonel in Reserve Miri Eisen, a senior fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University in Herzliya. It's good to see you, Miri. I'd like to ask you particularly about what does it mean, Hamas without its leader, Yahya Sinwar, who has been radio silent for quite some time and has only recently relayed a certain message to Qatar. The Qatari Prime Minister just yesterday during a press availability at the European Commission in Brussels highlighted that there hasn't been any progress in negotiations for the release of hostages. Mr. Oren just mentioned a number of questions. Give us a little bit of an overview. What are we to expect?
Yahya Sinwar was not just the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. In that sense, he was the mastermind of the October 7th attack, meaning what we've exposed in the different computer material that's been taken out of the Gaza Strip since the Israeli military operation inside the Gaza Strip has shown that this is something that Yahya Sinwar was planning together with a close-knit group of his close, both his brother and other close officials, terrorists. And so when he disappears, Jonathan, I literally, this is different than Hassan Nasrallah in its very odd way, because in this case, this was Yahya Sinwar's attack. This was Yahya Sinwar and his close advisors doing this horrific genocidal attack that you so clearly describe every time that happened on October 7th, 2023, and his disappearance changes the equation. It isn't now suddenly that they say somebody else steps in and makes the decisions. That immediately means, first and foremost, what happens with the hostages. When I say that nobody is there now to make those decisions, I strongly believe that it was Yahya Sinwar who both planned and was the mastermind, and that the hostages were both for him a protection, but mainly they were a bargaining chip. And so the question is, who now makes those decisions? Who is the one who's looking at the bargaining chip? And in that sense, I look at that as the key issue right now. Who are the pressure points? Who is whoever's going to step in, do instead? And if this does bring about more of a disintegration of Hamas capabilities, I want to hope that it will bring about a possibility to do something with the hostages. I also want to bring up, because I'm always the one who does so, and I don't like to ignore it, that it can bring about a chaos and a revenge against those same hostages. So he's gone. That makes a huge difference. I want to hope that it can bring about a change when it comes to the hostages that Hamas still holds. I need to call out that there's the possibility that Hamas will do something terrible with the hostages right now.
Indeed. With that being said, of course, we do need to remember the fact that Hamas is utilizing the hostages as bargaining chips. And the question is whether or not they're going to just throw those bargaining chips in one way or another and lose additional ground beyond the devastation of losing their top leader, which is, of course, having an organization run just like a headless chicken. But let's now turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, formerly an Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, among others. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you particularly on this later announcement, what would the American reaction be to such a development, considering the fact that Hamas is a designated foreign terrorist organization, Yahya Sinwar is on its wanted list? Are there significant repercussions to such a reality in which, now that CIA Director Bill Burns still heavily engaged in trying to reach some sort of cessation of hostilities for the Gaza Strip, will have to get more heavily involved in trying to figure out what are the right next moves from an American perspective?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's hard to say congratulations, but it is always good to see when justice is brought to terrorists like Yahya Sinwar, who's got so much blood on his hands. I believe I agree with Colonel Mira that, in fact, the near-term question is what happens to the hostages. It's highly unlikely that Sinwar had not had this conversation, appointed a successor already, and what his plans were and what his hopes were for his successor after he got killed. Clearly, Sinwar knew that his days were numbered. It was only a matter of time before he was caught. And those conversations in the bunkers certainly had to be had. So I would suspect that on the sad issue of the hostages, the news would probably come sooner rather than later on their fate.
Indeed. Well, let's now turn to the northern front, since Mr. Oren, you mentioned a number of casualties. Of course, there are also additional gains, additional operational achievements, tactical achievements along the frontier, but give us a little bit of a broader understanding of the various developments at hand.
Sure. But just one other note regarding Sinwar. Tomorrow, October the 18th, is the day Sinwar was released from Israeli jail
2011.
back in 2011 in the so-called Gilad Shalit deal, in exchange for the Israeli soldier who was abducted in 2006. So he lived as a Hamas leader for 13 years, almost to the day. Now, in the north, there are two arenas. One is Beirut and its environs, and the other is South Lebanon, especially south of the Litani. Of course, there are other parts of Lebanon where Hezbollah has been entrenched or where Iran has tried to transfer weapons and equipment, and Israel strikes those too. But the two important ones are the Lebanese capital, Beirut, and the area adjacent to the Israeli region, the Galilee. In Beirut, after a pause of some 5 days, there has been another strike at an underground facility that Hezbollah had in a residential area. And by the way, it echoes what CENTCOM has announced regarding its attack on Houthi targets in Yemen, including with B-2 bombers. And the message there was, we can come from anywhere, doesn't have to be in the Middle East, and hit underground facilities, no matter how deep and what the depth of the concrete is going to be. So this was Beirut. In South Lebanon, the Israeli Northern Command has been going from one place to another, villages or so-called nature reserves, finding too many Hezbollah outposts, some above ground, some in apartments and villas, some underground, with a lot of equipment, motorcycles, of course, many munitions, missiles, guns, everything needed for the so-called Radwan force, the assault force, which prepared to spring out of these bunkers a few meters sometimes from the Israeli border and storm the Israeli villages, massacre the civilians there, try to occupy at least a part of Israel, plant their flag, get its picture, and wait for the IDF to push them back into Lebanon. So this particular operation, while not over yet, has been successful in both exposing and eliminating the Hezbollah capability.
Indeed. Colonel Eisen, a couple of days ago, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant traveled to the northern front. He was alongside, of course, the Northern Command Commander, Major General Ori Goldin, and they had a comprehensive discussion there with division commanders on the various modus operandi currently undertaken in Lebanon. One of the remarkable statements made by the Jerusalem top defense official was that any forward base of Hezbollah, any village that was utilized as a forward base by Hezbollah, so heavily fortified, developed into subterranean infrastructure, and with every house pretty much having various tools, military tools for such an offensive, which was just characterized by Mr. Oren, would be utterly destroyed. Come yesterday, suddenly we see a entire village being razed to the ground pretty much in the area of Kana in southern Lebanon, something that, of course, trickled a lot of echo throughout Lebanon, and questions arise. Are we now going to destroy every village along the front lines in reality, having all those villages, of course, similar infrastructure embedded in pretty much every house?
I wonder at this stage along the way what we do in that day after, when UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, that had an upgraded mandate from 2006 specifically to stop the entrance of weapons south of the Litani River. And what do we do right now with this enormous arsenal upon arsenal of weapons that, as Amir said, are both in open areas and, as you just said, inside towns and villages? I'm going to hope that we do not raise Lebanon. This is not about Lebanon. It is about the challenge of a failed state, Lebanon, that has no responsibility in the eyes of the world for anything, to have existing within it what is a state within a state that has this enormous terror army, and that this terror army is inside towns, villages, underground, with all of these locations. I don't know of a right way to do it. I want to hope that we won't do it a wrong way. I do know that as an Israeli living inside my country, south of that, UN blue line, that I cannot live here knowing that a mile, 2 kilometers, 4 kilometers, 10 kilometers north of me are these enormous arsenals of weapons, with every single type of weapon you can think of, coming in from Iran, with Russian letters, with Chinese letters, that are just there. And surrounding them, and you haven't mentioned that, are almost 50 United Nations different posts that are throughout southern Lebanon. So I don't see us destroying southern Lebanon. I do see us trying to eliminate as much as the weapons as possible, to try as much as possible to expose it, to try to have the international community that has had all of these forces there all of these years actually acknowledge that they absolutely did nothing to prevent this.
129 both posts and installations of UNIFIL spread out throughout southern Lebanon. Quite significant presence if one expects that this international mandate was supposed to observe and avoid the reality that existed at hand. But General Kimmett, State Department spokesman Matthew Miller, responded to a question on the raising of one of those villages along the blue line. He highlighted that the United States, under the current administration, expects Israel to avoid targeting civilian buildings, albeit they situated above terror infrastructure or military infrastructure, both subterranean and within it. How does the United States expect that actually to happen in practice?
Well, first of all, I think that we've had this conundrum, as you have for years and years, that when the terrorists and insurgents, in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, use protected areas for their military activities, by law and by UN regulations, they lose that protected status. Nonetheless, it never looks good when you're attacking a mosque or you're attacking a village. And that, of course, is one of those where, at least in our military, the target has to be so significant that not only you have to meet the strictures of international law, but you also have to meet the Washington Post test. So it's done reluctantly, it's done infrequently, but when it has to be done, it's done. Jonathan, I'd like to take 30 seconds to observe that strike inside of Yemen, because it is notable for a number of reasons. Number one, they did use B-2 bombers that can go anywhere around the world. Number two, they used weapon systems that could attack deep, hard and deeply buried targets. And number three, they were very clear to announce that in their public press release. And one wonders if that's not simply a message to the Houthis, but to Iran as well, that we've got not only the capability, but in the case of the Houthis, the intention to use those deep, hard and buried target capabilities, if that's not simply a message for the region, but obviously a message for Iran as well when it comes to their nuclear facilities.
Indeed. Well, I absolutely believe it was intended as a message to Iran, similar to the strike utilizing a Moab munition against the headquarters of Wilayat Khorasan in the Khorasan region north of Afghanistan, which was a signal to China and other adversaries in the region. Here, too, utilizing a B-2 is simply put an overkill to the intended targets, and therefore it does also inform the Iranians that the United States has the capabilities and the tools at its disposal to degrade any infrastructure in Iranian hands. But with that, Mr. Oren, I'd like to ask you specifically. Yesterday, we saw the commander of the RGC, Hussein Salami, come out and declare during a funeral procession of the deputy commander of the Quds Force, who was killed alongside Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut earlier, that he is warning Israel and Israeli officials that the true promise 2, as they refer to the October 1st strike against Israel, was only a warning, apparently, and that neither Israel's aerial defense array nor that of the integration of the THAAD system right now in Israel would prevent Iranian offensive capabilities from penetrating and reaching their targets in a future attack, threatening that any attack against Iran, either in Iran or outside of Iran, will be met with a decisive response. Is this yet again a display of sweat, such as we see on Naim Qassem, the Deputy Secretary General of Hezbollah in Lebanon?
These here are fighting words, as they used to say in the Wild West. And Iran is in the Wild East, if you look at it from an Israeli perspective. So that means that we are going to have True Promise 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's a franchise. So I don't think that the decision makers in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are too concerned about such declarations. They are not going to be deterred. The Sinwar episode might change some minds in Israel because there is no need for two such important developments in the 2.5 weeks before the US elections. So that may have some impact on timing. But Iranian threats do not carry too much value here.
Indeed. Colonel Eisen, in March earlier this year, we heard General Michael Kurilla, the commander of CENTCOM, speaking in the Armed Services Committee of both the House and the Senate, during the course of which he did highlight that the major issue of the Houthis holding a sophisticated or advanced weaponry and munitions is not necessarily the degradation of those munitions or the lacking intelligence to deal with that, but rather the fact that the Islamic Republic of Iran is the core principled source of all those munitions being delivered to the Houthis, and the need to basically block the Iranians from doing so. Was the B-2 strike a potential signal to the Iranians, as also General Kimmett has mentioned rightly? And do you think that that such a message carries any weight in Iran as opposed to the remarks by Salami in Israel?
The Middle East is very impacted by actions, not just by words. Words make a difference, ideology is out there. But there's no question that when you take action in the Middle East, that is something that is noted. I think that we, Jonathan, over the years have spoken extensively at the difference between both U.S. rhetoric and U.S. action, and for that matter, of any of the other actors. The United States acted. They acted, as described so eloquently before, in a different way than they have before. That is a message that is understood both in Iran and by the Houthis, and for that matter, by the U.S. allies, if it's Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries. This is the United States taking action. Is it enough? I welcome this action. I am very one of those who have always said that I feel that we need not to be alone in this. This is not an Israeli multi-front war. We are literally at the forefront for the rest of the world, and I hate being melodramatic about it. So I'm very happy in that sense that the United States has taken such an action specifically against the Houthis, that they're sending weapons that are important both into Israel, and that in general we're not standing alone as if this is all about Iran against Israel or the proxies against Israel. This is about the Islamic regime of Iran, as you said, doing what they do, and it's a very welcome step at this stage.
Since November 17 of last year, we saw the Houthis join the fight against Israel and the West at large. They are not hiding their intention to target either US, UK, or other partner vessels in the Red Sea or Bab el-Mandeb and adjacent waterways. General Kimmett, over 100 vessels have already been struck, and it doesn't seem like the Houthis are overly deterred, irrespective of messaging to the Iranians with the B-2 bombers, at least from what I read in the various public domain statements. Nonetheless, to what degree does such an event carry weight among the other tribes which pledged allegiance to the Houthis for the simple fact that they received the funds and munitions that the Houthis pledged from the Iranians, once again involving that connection in their various activities throughout Yemen and beyond?
Sadly, I don't think it's going to carry much of an actual practical message. The fact remains the Houthis have been successfully carrying out counter-ship operations, at least launching of counter-ship operations since October 7th. And the fact remains is that while there have been intercepted, in most cases destroyed, and no significant craft destroyed in the process, they have not yet been defeated. They are still, Muqawama resistance fighters, and the very fact that the B-2 was used and perhaps knocked out a couple of facilities only, in my mind, emboldens their terrorist affiliates to say, look, if that's the best the U.S. can throw at us, let's keep doing this. So I'm glad to see that we're doing it. Kurilla's admission in the House Armed Services Committee that these are coming from Iran, but also that he has been unsuccessful in intercepting the vast majority of imports from Yemen and elsewhere from Iran, tells me that these resistance fighters, these terrorist fighters, aren't really deterred, won't be deterred. And unfortunately, they've got to find the same fate in Yemen that Sinwar found.
With that, we have run out of time, so I'd like to thank General Kimmett, Colonel Eisen, and Mr. Owen for all of your insights. And I'd like to thank also all of you at home. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, wishing you, of course, Chag Sameach, and until our next update. Shalom. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.